Mark, thank you for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
It's only 2 months. You've only got 2 months left as Governor of the Bank of England. You've already blagged your way into 2 jobs, both of a green nature. One as, this is an unfortunate misprint from my particular thing. I wrote as Boris Johnson's fiancé, but what I actually meant, finance advisor for the COP26 Climate Change Conference. No doubt the other role is still available. But you've also been appointed. You've also been appointed the UN Special Envoy for Climate Change, succeeding a man called Mike Bloomberg.
Yeah, I thought I was being offered Bloomberg's other job that he was giving up.
That's it. There could be many options.
Yeah.
Just to start,
Focus.
5 years ago, you did the speech about the tragedy of the horizon, and you talked about the way that the catastrophic impacts of climate change hadn't really been processed. Do you think that horizon is coming closer now? Do you think it's getting better?
Yeah, well, certainly the horizon's getting closer, in part because progress has been limited in terms of addressing the underlying causes of climate change. It's also the horizon from a financial sector perspective is getting closer because the understanding of these issues has broadened considerably. And I would say it's not quite parabolic, but over the course of the last 18 months or so, something which has been largely on the periphery of finance has moved very close to the mainstream. And the question is, over the course of the next 12 months, or well, it's not 12 months, in 11 months between now and COP, can we put in place the sort of building blocks that are necessary for financial actors, whether they're investors, pension funds, insurers, banks, or individuals, family offices, so that they can make their own judgments about climate as part of their portfolios.
Which is the crucial building block from your point of
Well,
view?
it starts, it's so obvious, but it's basic information. And it's not so much, it's comparable, consistent information, not so much about the static carbon footprints or GHG footprints, I should be clear, of companies, but what their transition paths are expected to be. So what's their strategy for moving to a lower carbon footprint? And different companies, different financial institutions will have different strategies, but that will make a market. And the way we think about it is there needs to be a market in transition. And what we did develop with Mike Bloomberg, he headed a private sector consortium to develop disclosure standards around this, the TCFD.
That was the reporting part.
That is the
return.
reporting part. So we think, yeah. So if I give the whole framework, and let me just step back and so we can frame it. So what we want to do for COP26 on the private side is to put in place the reporting side, TCFD based. There are a number of companies and 120 trillion of balance sheet that wants this reporting, companies that report it, 120 trillion of balance sheet that wants it. It's been out for about 2 years. We want it refined. We want it focused in on what's most decision useful and efficient for companies to report, but used by investors or banks or providers of capital. So that's the first R. We think we can get that for COP26. And then we expect that to become mandatory in some jurisdictions, and if not mandatory, expected in others, and driven, again, by the private sector.
Just on that one, do you think that's being driven? What's happened coming into this Davos? You have a lot of people. You have Larry Fink with BlackRock.
Yep.
Adela at Microsoft. You have people making really quite big commitments, much bigger than we've seen recently. Do you think there has been a change, especially on the investment side?
I think there has been a change on the investment side. I think there is. We see it very clearly in the city, in that climate is becoming one of the vectors for investment. So you always looked at credit risk, interest rate risk, future cash flows, but transition risk. Where is a company on the transition? What's their plan? Now there is a big market in that. And there's a lot of judgment that's necessary both for senior management of companies to think through these issues and for the providers of capital. And that's what finance does well. You get a lot of smart people thinking about
Are you confident that central banks can keep pushing this? I mean, you have been a notable, you've been a notable proponent of it, but other ones
so
have not.
what we have tried to do is first building blocks of the market information. Yeah. The first R. Second R, as central banks, what we have begun to see as the horizons moved in and transition risk has become more important. And of course, transition risk is driven by technological change, but also climate policy change. As that's become more important, what we've looked to do is to stress test the core of the banking system against those types of risks. And so the Bank of England launched stress tests a few months ago. There will be a number of central banks there are a number that are following suit, and we expect over the course of the year to sort of build a coalition of central banks that are stress testing their banks for these types of risks.
You don't worry that, perhaps with you no longer at the Bank of England, that particular cause will go? You think that is now embedded in the system?
I don't worry at all. There's no key person risk, I think, on these issues, which is why the horizon's moving in. So there are 50 central banks around the world who are part of something called the NGFS, and one of the 3 main work streams is exactly on this issue, and that's decided by those central banks, including most of the major emerging economy central banks as well. I mean, in effect, all the major central banks bar the Fed.
What about the UN, this big amorphous institution? We're talking to Christiana later, but what? Well, do you think that is something that could really make progress at COP26? The last meeting in Madrid was not a stellar success.
Well, there's a rhythm to and Christiana is better placed to speak to this, but there are a rhythm to these meetings, and they tend to go in cycles, and every 5 years tends to be a big one. That's my experience. Sometimes they work. Paris, sometimes they don't. Copenhagen. The intent, obviously, of the UK and Italian governments, who are co-chairs, important point here. So think G7 and G20 chairs for 2021. UK, Italy. The intention, of course, is to make this a success. The private finance side is an important component. That's the bit I'm focused on. There are crucial other negotiations, and there's a crosswalk between the two, if I can put it that way, around Article 6 issues where you have intergovernmental attempts to establish a private market, and I think the question should start to be asked whether there are private solutions. I mean, the private sector knows how to develop OTC markets. They do it very well. There's proven technology around that, and probably not enough attention has been.
It's possible for those markets to take off. Would those markets take off much better with a carbon tax?
There is an
Now, are you a supporter of a carbon tax?
I'm a supporter of a carbon tax, but I'm not. I don't think I'm naive about it. It is one of many policy options that needs instruments that need to be used. And I think there's an important point where you think about having the right information from companies, having the financial sector thinking about a transition from where we are, where we need to get to. Different opinions about the speed of that transition. And the interaction with policy. So if there is a credible path to a carbon tax, so starting low, expected to go higher, or a credible path to tightening of climate policy, what the market will do will be to bring forward that adjustment. So companies that are better prepared for higher carbon taxes in the future, the market will pull that forward. But I think what's clear around carbon taxes is, it's not the silver bullet. They're not the silver bullet, rather. And secondly, that the design of them, it's very important to take into. I mean, the Canadian-style design, where effectively the carbon tax is returned to individuals, is important because not only is climate change regressive. A carbon tax can be regressive. Given
you were referring to France in that. Was that the example of the one? You were just hyping the Canadians. You were hyping the Canadians.
Accentuate the positive where possible on this.
Yes.
Yeah.
But going forward, but in terms of that actual meeting, do you think how committed is Boris to climate change? I mean, Cameron used to make it.
The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
The United Kingdom. Your fiancé.
My fiancé. Rumors are, we're just very close. Look, it's an extremely important process. It's not just a meeting. It's an extremely important process. The Prime Minister is very focused on this. I've met with him several times on it. And I think the full weight of the UK government will be engaged in it, as we would expect, not just the Italian government, but also our European partners.
Who do you see as leading the climate change debate more generally? Obviously, you have Donald Trump is not necessarily on side on this, but who do you see worldwide as the people who are really pushing this?
Well,
on the political space.
Well, okay, so it's interesting to pull it back into political space, because I think what is happening is over the course of the last several years, and part of the reason why the Horizon's being brought in is popular opinion has shifted quite substantially, and then business and finance have moved quite substantially, and I think there's a lot of momentum there. Now, one of the challenges for finance, and this is one of the issues we want to work on, is how to translate progress in readily understandable terms to the people we serve, to the population. So on one level, it's very satisfying to say only invest in or only lend to deep green projects. But that's not going to deliver us a energy transition. It's not going to deliver us in a timely way, in an efficient way, in an effective way, a move from a high carbon to a net zero world. So we need to get better at explaining where we are today in terms of the trajectory for degree warming as one metric, and where we can get to tomorrow. So one of the things I'll do in a couple of hours is sit down with something called the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which is the big pension funds, the big insurers, who are committed to net zero, but also report, the biggest of them, report the degree warming potential of their portfolio. And if you're the Japan pension fund, you own the market, because that's under their articles. Effectively, their job is to own the market. They're at 3.7 degrees. If you actively manage it, you can get it down into the 3s. Some can get into the 2s, but they're setting objectives in a way that people can understand.
Do you think there's, I mean, having interviewed Larry Fink yesterday, do you think that there is an element amongst investors at the moment whereby the easy side is saying, yes, I'm investing in all these renewable technologies? The difficult bit for investors and lenders and pension funds is say, I'm withdrawing money from people who I see as on the wrong side of that equation.
Do I think that? I think that is. I think that. Well, I'll give my personal view, which is that this is a whole of economy transition, and in every sector of the economy, there are companies that will be part of the solution, and there will be companies that, for whatever reason, lag. Just like in any other aspect of competition. And those who lag are going to get punished. Those who are part of the solution should get rewarded. I think what has not yet, what's not yet clear enough is where the choke points are. So let's take oil and gas. Within oil and gas, there are companies who are managing their portfolios, who are investing more in renewables, who have greater prospects of being participating all the way through the energy transition. It's for investors and banks to decide who those are.
You're not with Greta Thunberg and those people who just say we should pull out of all investing, lending to those people.
Well, I think there are many positive contributions.
Dangerous woman to take on.
There are many positive contributions from Greta Thunberg. One of them is just to put on the table some of the facts or some of the boundaries to this debate. So a point she consistently makes, which is that under the best estimates of the Paris stretch goal of 1.5 degrees, 66% probability, a kind of probability a prudent central banker would recognize. On current emissions, we have about 8 years left on that carbon budget. Okay. So if we have 8 years, so let's take, I mean, it's a legitimate point to make. If you make that point, if you're sitting as an investor, you think, okay, so how many barrels are going to get consumed over that period? How quickly do we move to gas? What's going to get reinvested? What does net zero actually mean? How many barrels are produced at net zero? Or is that probability off for some reason? Or are we going to overshoot and then come back? Do I do 2 degrees because I think that, and it should be 60, and then that changes the horizon from 8 to somewhere closer to 20. That's a market in transition. Now, I suspect in this room, most people in this room know answers to that question, have opinions on those questions, have a view on where it goes. But that's not the case in the mass of the market. I think it will be the case in the mass of the market over the course of the next few years, because more and more of that information is fed through. I mean, we have energy companies on the trajectory to become net zero themselves, and you get a much better sense of where the transition is. But there's the point I'm making in quite a roundabout way, is that there are those who will be out in front on the transition, those who lag, and that's different from in all sectors, and that's different than just a binary green good, everything else brown bad. And it's a slightly cheesy line, but consistent with the start of this interview, you know, we think there should be 50 shades of green, if not more, in order for there to be judgments about a transition from, you know, olive to beige all the way down to
You've been looking at this for quite a long time, and I know you're personally interested in this. Part of the genesis of the interview came you and me meeting in West Hampstead Market buying green things. But anyway,
yes.
but part of the part of the issue behind this is there a technology that you think is really going to change things? I know you're not from the technology side, but you see an enormous amount of this. Is there one out of the various things that people are putting forward at the moment? If you had to bet, which one would you go for?
Well, I think one of the benefits of really getting people to think about the transition and what's the net in net zero is it focuses on the technology choke points in various industries and, you know, hard to abate sectors, the importance of hydrogen and making hydrogen economic in the net, thinking about carbon capture and storage or carbon capture and use, and the Microsoft announcement, I think, also shines a light on this. It's interesting, the sort of organic CCS opportunities appear interesting, are wildly underinvested relative to, you know, battery technology, other aspects. They would appear to be important, at least on current technologies and current technology pathways, important to achieve some form of net zero. And so I suspect, I suspect, and you can see some of the leading investors in those, that a fair bit of money is going to be put in there, and they'll be part of the solution. Now, which specific, and there are many options ranging from olivine to, well, that's the one I can remember. There's a range of other ones. So don't take my investment advice.
In terms of, you come to Davos a lot, do you think it's true that this time things have changed, that there really is an element both on the financial side and on the corporate side, that people are now beginning to do real things about this rather than just talking about it?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. I do think it's changed. And I think what's happened to it, and we'll see real progress, not just COP. I mean, it's important that we make progress at COP26, but the more the conversation is about solutions, your question about technologies, realistic discussions about the energy transition and debates about the energy transition that are working towards common solutions, the more effective it's going to be. Look, in the end, you know, markets solve problems, right? And very effectively. There needs to be a common understanding of the problem. I think what's being built up is a common understanding of the problems, the main drivers, and through that we'll make progress.
One last thing on it. Is it possible to have a common understanding without America being part of that common understanding?
It's certainly much more difficult. It's much more difficult, but it's, I would say that some of the leading thinking, both in the financial sector and certainly on the technology side, is coming out of the U.S. So it seems to be, and you know, U.S. companies and financial institutions are global, and you know, they think about these issues, and they can see where the horizon is as well.
Last thing on that, do you think it's conceivable? Do you think it's just likely in the end that the West ends up paying money directly to India and China to bring these numbers down?
Depends how you frame it. By which I mean, if I, as a company, I'm not saying this absolutely will happen, but let's say over the next few years, it becomes more and more important that big companies are in a position where they have a strategy to get to net zero.
Yeah.
Where's the net going to come from? What's going to be the most efficient abatement opportunity? It is not likely to be all resident in their country. So, and to the extent to which there is a credible and verifiable way of getting abatement in an emerging economy or a developing economy that's much lower cost, then is that paying for it, or is that, I mean,
you don't see governments stepping in to do that in the end.
Well, this
big charities.
Look, the scale of, I mean, big charities are big, but relative to the issue, look, I would rather stay on my safer patch of the finance sector. It's a big issue. I think that it's a big and hotly contested political issue. If we set up these markets, we will see these flows in sizes that actually, in the end, dwarf what's being discussed on a government-to-government basis.
Mark Carney, thank you very much
for
talking to Bloomberg Green.
Thank you.
Welcome to join us.